see familiar faces, but I see some new faces too, so welcome. My name is Helen Day. I am the president of Rural Wisdoms Project, and I'm really excited to welcome you to our first talk of our 2017-18 season. Those of you who have seen our flyers see that our theme is a little bit different this year. We're really concentrating on the arts. And I think there are going to be some absolutely terrific opportunities and activities. So I urge everybody to pick up a flyer on the back table. I think that's really all I need to do except invite up our board member who's going to introduce our speaker, Mary Ann.
Well, good evening. We'll try again. Well, good evening and welcome once again. We're delighted to have all of you here, bringing your wisdom and your vitality to this experience. As Helen mentioned, our theme this year is the theme of finding the sacred in the arts. And we might rephrase it, finding the sacred or finding the aha moment in the arts. And obviously what we're going to be doing in the year that lies ahead is entering into an opportunity to experience the arts from various faith traditions, and an opportunity to talk about that and to discuss where we might find the sacred or the aha in that multiple experience that characterizes us as a people on this planet. But before we can do that, we really need to perhaps just go back and revisit how we have good communication with one another. And certainly we are living at a time in all learners, which all of you are because you're here tonight, live in today. I suspect that Elizabeth will do just that for us tonight. But before we begin, we have a tradition in TIR, World Wisdoms Project, of blessing the moment, of blessing the presence of those of us who are here. And so I invite you, in whatever manner you wish to do that we gather together our collective consciousness to be truly present to this moment so that we all benefit. So if I can ask you to join us then. So Elizabeth, would you come forth and share your gifts with us tonight?
Yes. Please allow me a quick technological moment. Apologize, my bar is stuck at the bottom of that screen. I'm able to get rid of it. So I wanted to start with a quick thank you to TIR, to the World Wisdoms Project, for answering a call in the community to continue great work. Most importantly, I think, to instead of offering what is normally our learning system of I talk, you listen, to really begin to open ourselves up to all the wisdom that's in the room in our community. Special thanks for Mary Ann Baer, who tirelessly stalked me all year, working towards this project. I appreciate that motivation. And to all of you for the courage of showing up and being willing to learn from one another and have these good conversations. Is my volume working? Yes. I am a professor in the communication department department at CSU, so I teach fun things that everybody wants to take, like public speaking. But my work in the past 3 years has been what I now consider my calling, and that is multi-faith and belief engagement. So in plain words, I like to get the Christians and the Buddhists and the nuns, if you will, N-O-N-E-S, and the atheists and the Zen folks and all of them in the same room and learn how to have healthy conversations and engage and in many ways work together in solidarity to make the world a better place. And so I have the privilege of doing that, mind you, at a state institution. So I do still get calls from the provost saying, can you just tell me what we're doing again? But my reply is always the same. We're talking about issues of faith and belief, value and spirituality because we are a state institution. And if we're going to have talks about race and gender and those areas of diversity, why not talk about the ones that really empower people and talk about the ways they spend money and vote and raise their children? So I hope to share with you a little bit of that tonight. So to give you an idea of what's coming up, I'd like to share, I'm going to do a teacherly thing and provide some definitions for you. We're going to have a brief history lesson of ecumenism, interfaith, and multi-faith work. We're going to talk about some stumbling blocks about when we do get in the room, what are the barriers to having that healthy, engaging conversation. And then we'll talk about some best practices of how to get those conversations going. And then we're going to pass out some, not homework, but here work for you to do real quick. A little brief reading and reflection. And then if you dare, and I hope you do, have some actual conversation and dialogue around some topics. So let me begin. In our personal lives, how many times have we felt that begrudging sense of gratitude toward a loved one as they, for the 100th time, point out one of our fanatic or neurotic tendencies? And probably, for the 100th time, they provide the needed counterpoint or balance to our skewed sense of reality. Or within our larger communities, how many of us find ourselves at our wits' end, unable to manage a shred of respect for the political or religious other, who believe in their position just as strongly as we believe in our position? Do we find ourselves compartmentalizing them as them, and they as well as us? Do we ask ourselves questions like, how can they possibly think that way, or vote that way, or raise their children that way? And if we were honest to rate our level of anger, disgust, would it be on the same level as they have for us? At the table this evening, you might even be asking yourself, how do I look across the table at somebody I might completely disagree with and still value their self-determination and their own story? So throughout our evening together, I hope to delve into some of these questions and explore a metaphor that we'll come back to during the reading that you'll have a chance to reflect on. That one of my favorite authors, Rabbi Brad Hirschfield, which is a name I'll mention a lot tonight, who wrote a fabulous book titled, You Don't Have to Be Wrong for Me to Be Right. He uses a metaphor to explain our deepest relationships, interpersonal relationships, partners, siblings, as, quote, a helper who is against us. A helper who is against us. And he explains that it might be our most painful disagreements that arise because we share the same values. So I'd like us to think about that tonight. So with Hirschfield's help, we'll challenge you to perceive the religious or non-religious other person as just that juxtaposition, perhaps a helper who is against us. And perhaps they can even help us show a mirror to ourselves and our own neuroses or fanaticisms, but also experience another incarnation of the sacred that might just be sitting across the table from us. So let us begin with some definitions. So I wanted to start off with a definition that might be more familiar to you than if we jumped into interfaith or multi-faith and belief. Especially because of the history of Theologians in Residence, now World Wisdom's project that grounded itself very much with the Catholic Church. I thought I'd start with ecumenism. So the term ecumenism or ecumenical comes from the Greek term that means the whole inhabited world. Right? And the goal of ecumenism, as understood by the Catholic Church as well as the World Council of Churches, is a full and visible unity, sacramental life and ministry between Christians with the intent of glorifying God and bringing the whole world to believe in Jesus Christ. So as many of you, I imagine in this room, have been involved in some type of ecumenical effort at one point or another, bridging denominations, usually in the realm of solidarity, of human rights, serving the most vulnerable populations within our community. Oftentimes we can gather around and forgive our differences when we're serving together. And that is one of the great outcomes of service. I'll leave you with this slide for just a moment, and I'll walk you through it if the text is a bit too small. But as of 2015, according to the Pew Research Center, these are the ratios of our global religious population demographics on the planet. So as of right now, Christians are at 2.3 billion, 31%. Muslims, 24%. Hindus, 15%. Buddhists, about 7%. Folk and tribal religions, about 6%. Jews, 0.2%. Other religions, almost 1%. And unaffiliated at 16%. Now, Pew Research does this study every 3 to 5 years, so you can look for yourself to see what these changes are. But as you can see, there is a large population that is, of course, not Christian, and ecumenical efforts are bound in that way. Back to our definitions then. The next one, as the scope becomes wider, is interfaith. 2 words, obviously, inter, crossing those bridges like an interstate, connecting states, and faith, bridging between those faiths. Now, I'm sure that you're aware most of the common, especially in U.S. America, the most common interfaith work is done between the Abrahamic traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam because of the shared roots, history, sacred texts, etc., etc. The next word that we're going to delve in tonight is the most broad, and that is multi-faith and belief, which is a new-ish term that many in this field are using because it reaches out beyond the term faith, which is prickly for some, not in a good way, based on experiences, our past histories, etc., etc. This is the most broad, and it allows for the term belief to bring in other systems of understanding of values, beliefs, morals, and ethics. This allows that 16% to be welcomed to the table. This allows, if you will, non-believers to be welcomed to the table, which, if we're honest, for many of us, is a little bit of a barrier or a stopping point. Major questions might come up like, why do we invite somebody who already doesn't believe in God into a conversation about our most precious values and beliefs? So I hope to explore some of those elements with you as well. So to introduce you to a little bit more of that 16% that we looked at, I just want to put some names on your radar. And in U.S. American culture, 23 to 25% of our demographic identifies as just this, unaffiliated in one way or another. It's a broad miscellaneous category that where we kind of just throw in the rest, right? But some of these terms, agnostic, atheist, humanist, SBNR, have you heard that one before? Nothing in particular, and we, in an endearing term, often classify this as the nuns, not N-U-N-S, but N-O-N-E-S, the nuns. What's interesting, although it can be a stumbling block, is to look at our perception that we have when engaging in conversation between religious and non-religious. Because oftentimes we have a lot of stereotypes that come up. We attach political values to specific names. So we want to think of ways that we share those values, common beliefs, core values that we organize our lives around. Because atheist parents want to raise good children too. So we want to invite all to the conversation. Okay, so what I'd like to do is now offer a little bit of a history lesson for you. And for those of you that were the Interfaith Council meeting on Thursday, you got a little hint of this already, because I gave you a smattering of the interfaith movement. I wanted to start with ecumenical wins and ways that ecumenical Christian churches have come together, and then we'll broaden that scope a little bit to look at big moments in multi-faith, interfaith games, if you will. So one that's probably familiar to many of you, the Second Vatican Council, where lots of decisions that were made in a nonverbal way that looked like this. Right? So we have ecumenical gains like the vernacular liturgy. We walked away from the Latin-based liturgy in hopes that people would have a greater understanding, a greater connection with that. Many other decisions were made, including ones that really opened up the Catholic Church to be in agreement, better understanding, solidarity, and affiliation with their other Christian brothers and sisters. As a side note, as a humorous side note, as I was researching the Second Vatican Council a little bit, someone wrote an article in 1967 after the close of the council, and they said as they were walked in, as the delegates were walked in, they were walked past a huge statue of Martin Luther, and engraved at the bottom it said, "In your heart, you know who's right." Another big achievement that's happened much more recently is the joint declaration on the Doctrine of Justification. Anybody heard of this before? It was quite a big, momentous thing. And if you're not familiar with this idea of justification, it deals with how Christians understand and conceptualize human guilt, sin, forgiveness, and things like that. And it was one of the big tenets, or theses, that Martin Luther was protesting against. So many, many years later, in 1999, the Vatican and the Lutheran World Federation signed, as well as the World Methodist Council in 2016, signed this agreement that we all finally agree on this doctrine. You know, nothing like taking 500 years to figure that out. But we all finally agree on these basic tenets. And with that, there was a kind of a renewal in the ecumenical spirit, if you will, to move us forward in our joint understandings and tenets of theology. And then, of course, we would be remiss if we ignored that this was the 500-year anniversary of the Reformation, of Luther's theses on the wall. And it's on October 31st this year, if you want to dress up as Luther this year. But many, because of this celebration, and many of you might know that Pope Francis visited Sweden last year on this day to kind of do the inaugural beginning to a year-long celebration here. But there's many congregations and parishes that are joining together globally to use this as a stepping stone to bridge conversation, to maybe bury old hatchets, if you will, but also honor differences among us and see those as a reason to get together together, celebrate, discuss, and learn more about one another. During the visit to Sweden, Pope Francis said in a joint statement with Bishop Yunnan, head of the Lutheran World Federation, that the two churches would continue to work toward removing obstacles preventing Catholics and Lutherans from sharing the Eucharist together. This was a pretty large step. During this time, Elizabeth Eaton, who heads up the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, also said, "We have not yet arrived, but we claim that we are in fact on our way to unity." So lots of great ecumenical steps. So now let me branch out a little bit wider for us to that interfaith engagement between. So clearly we have an advancing tide of Christian ecumenicism. I always mess that word. That's a tough one. How do we change its pronunciation from ecumenism to ecumenicalism? There we go. Author Christopher Ruddy from America Magazine, which is a Jesuit review, in 2010 said, "The ecumenical movement has entered a new phase, passing from the enthusiasm followed immediately by the Second Vatican Council to maturity and sobriety of certain recent years. One might speak of ecumenism as reaching a midlife crisis that now can either lead to weariness and resignation or recommitment and renewal." So lots of people are recognizing that we are in that moment of transition. I'd like to add a quote here from CSU President Tony Frank, who I think says this also very well. He said, in many applications, "If you don't like the feeling of change, you'll like the feeling of irrelevance even less." Let me just say that again. If you don't like the feeling of change, you'll like the feeling of irrelevance even less. So hold that in your heart as we're thinking about these conversations, the way we perceive others, and the baggage we bring to the table, but still how important it is to move forward, even though it's scary. So many congregations, many denominations, many faiths have begun to hear this call, and I'd like to honor the very place that we're sitting in for their work. A few years ago, the United Methodist Church put out guidelines for encouraging interreligious relationships. Here are a few of their instructions. Identify various faith communities and familiarize your congregation with them. Initiate dialogues with different faith communities, remaining sensitive to historical tensions. Work with persons of faith to resolve, economic, social, cultural, and political problems in your community. Plan community celebrations with an interreligious perspective, together with other persons of faith traditions, and develop new models of community building that strengthen relationships and allow people to dwell together while still honoring the integrity of our differences. Those are well thought out instructions. So it's pretty obvious that we have some gusto behind this. So let's look at some faces that are doing this. Before we dive into that, though, it's important to note that we do live in a very polarized world, especially when it comes to politics. Right? So there are a number of recent articles that really prove that. I just want to throw these out because I think their titles are hilarious. One of them that was just written by the New York Times says, quote, this is the title of it, "Your rabbi, probably a Democrat. Your Baptist pastor, probably a Republican. Your priest, who knows?" So a lot of the books that I'm going to talk about in just a moment are daring to not only bridge religious difference, faith value difference, but talking about the ways that politics and values inform one another and how we need to be having those conversations. So let's look at some major players, again, within this broader context of multi-faith belief. So we begin at the beginning of the modern interfaith movement, back in 1893 in Chicago with the World's Parliament of Religions gathering. And this was an attempt
to create global dialogue of faiths. And they did a fairly good job at starting this. And the reason this was kind of momentous is because it was at this moment that in the Western study of religion, Christianity was decentered from its central focus. It wasn't what we all studied first from this point. We began to look at the religious other, if you will, very differently and with much more honor and respect. Now, if you're interested, in 2008, the Parliament will be meeting up in Toronto. They were in Salt Lake in 2015, and it's still a very active organization. So let's get a bus. A few famous names, I'm sure you've heard. Mahatma Gandhi, of course, involved in India's liberation from Britain. Devout Hindu, who considered religious figures such as Buddha, Moses, Krishna, Jesus, Zoroaster, and Muhammad as divine incarnations, and used wisdom, especially in ethical and moral situations, to draw from. He was especially embraced the ethical teachings of Christ by the Sermon on the Mount and suffering and forgiveness. And that's what a lot of what I want to show you in the next few minutes is how a lot of these interfaith heroes, if you will, cross and inspire one another, and they allow themselves to be open to the wisdom of other traditions instead of closed. However, as the metaphor that I mentioned in the beginning from the author Hirschfield, a helper who is against us, Gandhi was also very critical of those who operated by name only. I've always loved this quote. Of course, Dr. King, in his activism, Christian Baptist, viewed his faith as a bridge to cooperation rather than a barrier of division. In his great World House speech that you might have heard in the past, he says, quote, "This is the great new problem of mankind. We have inherited a great world house in which we now have to live together. Black, white, Easterner, Westerner, Gentile, Jew, Catholic, Protestant, Muslim, Hindu. Because we can never again live apart, we must somehow learn to live with each other in peace." King modeled most of his strategies of his nonviolent protest, jail time, boycotting, after Gandhi's strategies in India. You might know that. And King called Gandhi, quote, "the first person in history to lift the ethic of love of Jesus above mere interaction between individuals to a powerful and effective social force." And King did receive a lot of criticism from his Christian followers for giving kudos to the Hindu for that. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, he believed the teachings of the Hebrew Gospels were the inspiration for the civil rights movement, protesting Vietnam and standing up for social injustices. King and Heschel, as you can see here, found a common bond, did a lot of protesting together, heavily influenced one another again, and finding that solidarity in the scripture together. And here you can see they're walking arm in arm in the famous civil rights walk from Selma to Montgomery. And later Heschel wrote of this moment, "Our march was worship. I felt like my legs were praying." Take that on. 90 years old this year. 91 in October. Of course, an interfaith leader still among us, of nonviolence, and a very prolific author. At age 16, he became a Buddhist novice and was ordained in 1949. He went to Princeton to study comparative religions, but was drawn back to Vietnam during the war effort. However, he wasn't allowed in. He's been in exile for most of the time since then. Because of that, he traveled to France and established the Plum Village Buddhist Center. He's led retreats of reconciliation, sowing mindfulness into the work that he leads us to. Some of his readings you might have encountered before: Living Buddha, Living Christ,
talking a lot about reconciliation between Christianity and Buddhism. He also is a big advocate in the Israeli-Palestinian talks. Dr. King, as a Nobel laureate, nominated Thich Nhat Hanh for a Nobel Prize, saying, "I do not personally know of anyone more worthy than this gentle monk from Vietnam. His ideas for peace, if applied, would build a monument to religious peace, to a world brotherhood, and to humanity." He was not awarded the prize. The Interfaith Amigos. Anyone heard of these gentlemen? They're a YouTube TED Talk sensation. Known for their unique blend of spiritual wisdom and humor, Imam Rahman, Pastor Don McKenzie, and Rabbi Ted Falcon openly addressed the justifications, the issues, the errors, the problems within their own faith with exclusivism, homophobia, gender inequality, and violence. They openly address these, and they talk about those being that because we've strayed away from the core values of our faith, of love, unity, and compassion. We do it so well. And then a hero of mine, Eboo Patel, and founder and executive director of a wonderful organization that's just a powerhouse in this world of interfaith work and provides me with a lot of resources in teaching these classes as well. Is an American Muslim of Indian heritage. And while he was going to college at the University of Chicago and working at the Catholic Workers organization there, began to realize that conversations that involve culture and identity, multiculturalism, always kind of strayed away from religious, spiritual type of conversations. And so he began an organization where people could bring their whole selves to in conversation. He was part of Barack Obama's advisory council on faith-based neighborhood practices, and so he's been recognized nationally for a lot of his work. He founded, as I mentioned, the Interfaith Youth Corps based out of Chicago, and they organize national days like Better Together Day, that some of you have taken a part in, whether through the Interfaith Council or at CSU, where the goal is really just to dare yourself to go meet somebody of a different faith or belief tradition, break some boundaries, and make a new friend. Because really that's how we're going to change the culture. It's just relationship by relationship. So I wanted to also pause for a second. Let's all cross our fingers in technological hope here. I wanted to show you a little commercial that's put out by this organization just to give you a flavor for what they do. Their focus is mostly on higher education campuses.
The voices of religious intolerance are growing louder every day. They seek to divide us from one another. Muslim from Jew, Christian from Buddhist, Hindu from secular humanist. Historically, voices of unity have risen above the chorus of bigotry. Voices like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Mahatma Gandhi. But today, intolerance is on the march again. We need new interfaith leaders to speak up against the divisions growing wider in America each day. Are you ready to stand up for what's right? Led by founder Eboo Patel, IFYC inspires young leaders of different faiths to work together to improve their communities and serve others. This movement is growing on college campuses nationwide, and IFYC's interfaith leaders are on the front lines. With your help, the forces of inclusion in America will prevail again. Speak up by joining the Interfaith Youth Corps at ifyc.org.
So that's a little flavor of that organization. And as I mentioned, I'm just full of gratitude because they give away resources so freely to allow more of these conversations to happen. Okay, I'm going to pause here for just a moment because this is the point where I'm going to start to talk about non-religious, multi-faith heroes, if you will. And again, this might be the moment where the questions start to bubble up or the barriers start to show themselves. So I'll offer a little bit of a kind of brief metaphor to help bridge this. Unitarian Universalist writer Sarah Smalley offers us a helpful metaphor, if you will. So consider that all religions or belief systems offer us a bucket to carry the sacred with us throughout everyday life. So imagine your bucket, and you walk up to the river of life or wellspring or however you want to imagine it, scoop up some of that sacred and carry it with you in your everyday practice. And it's through ritual and fellowship and practice that the bucket becomes a container of meaning for us. Now, some of us are born into a tradition or a religion, and that bucket works very well to carry the sacred around, maybe for our whole entire lives. But for others, our direct experience requires a change in buckets. In my spiritual path, this was very much true. One bucket worked very well for me for a number of decades, until it didn't. And for a while, I brought the bucket and the contents and all of it all together because it felt so wrong for a while. But then I began to realize that I still experienced the sacred in my life. And like it or not, I had cobbled together a new type of bucket, and I was just walking around looking for a community to accept me in my bucket. All of us have a type of bucket that holds our experience of the sacred, and if that word's tough for you, you can name other terms in there. For some it's called Buddhism, for others Pentecostal Christian, for others it might be called physics, or dancing, or a quiet walk in the woods. But I share this metaphor with you because it really has become my life's work to bear witness to the importance of having all beliefs, all buckets, welcome at the table. Because in some ways we are all seekers and experience the mystery, whatever you name it. But to not allow certain titles at the table because they don't match yours, it really seems quite silly when you think about it. So I encourage you to acknowledge your maybe fears of this and move forward with it. So here are two examples of non-religious folks that are serving this category of multi-faith and belief engagement in phenomenal ways. So the first one is Greg Epstein, who serves as the humanist chaplain. He is a ordained humanist rabbi. Ordained humanist rabbi at Harvard. Now, in case you're unfamiliar with what humanism is, let me provide you a brief definition. Humanism is a progressive philosophy that affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good of humanity without theism or supernatural beliefs. So to rephrase that, kind of like atheism with a moral component. So he is an ordained humanist rabbi, and he's a very influential American author. And his famous book up here, as you can see, is titled Good Without God, What a Billion Non-Religious People Do Believe. And his premise in saying good without God is simply, let's be good to one another and to the planet because we just should do it. Regardless of whether you believe in doctrine, dogma, or deity that tells you to do or not, just do it because it's the right thing to do. Just a little bit on his background, because that might be a little bit confusing, I understand. He received his ordination as a humanist rabbi from the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism.
He holds a master's degree in Judaic Studies from the University of Michigan and a degree of Theological Studies from Harvard Divinity School. So he draws from a lot of traditions there. In an interview, Epstein says that being a humanist rabbi means that I combine Jewish culture with the belief that this world is all we have. And he is very much not anti-religious. Chris Stedman at Yale. Executive director of the Yale Humanist Community. And he's a writer. He also works in part with the Interfaith Youth Corps that I mentioned before. He wrote a book that was pretty pivotal in my spiritual path as well, called Faithiest. How an atheist found common ground with the religious. And he talks about being born without religion, finding religion, losing religion, and not developing a bitter taste in your mouth about religion, but using that as a bridge to continue those conversations, working together for the greater good. He didn't replace his belief with disdain. And it was because he had relationships with people that were religious. And they didn't fit the stereotype that many new atheists have about the religious, which is that it's the bane of human existence. So there are many that they consider them part of that none crowd that are really working for this greater good. Okay, there's your little history. Now for a tiny bit of philosophy before we talk about God. So what I want to talk about real quickly is what we bring to the table when we enter in a conversation with other people of different beliefs, faiths, traditions, etc. And I'm going to show you a quick list of approaches, perspectives, attitudes, and I ask yourself as you're listening to this list to see which one that might house you the most comfortably. And as I have written up there in very big text, this list is not mutually exclusive. So you might find yourself in a few of these different. But imagine a spectrum of attitudes that you can choose, embody as you approach conversation. The first one is exclusivism. And this is an attitude where we approach the religious other with an element of being correct or right. There's a big struggle for right and wrong there. Or maybe not even a struggle, maybe just the decision. So the religious other is evaluated in terms of correctness or rightness. Now, great conversations can happen here, but generally the learning stops at a very superficial level here, more just knowledge based. The next is inclusivism. And this is where a person would believe that significant religious truths can be found in multiple religions. But that the truth, and we're talking about capital T truth, however you define that, is more perfectly understood or revealed in one's own tradition. So let me read that again. Inclusivism, significant religious truths can be found in multiple religions, but that the truth is more perfectly understood in one's own tradition. Okay. Omnism. All religions contain truths, but no one religion has the corner on the market. All religions contain some truths, no one religion contains them all. Relativism. All religions boil down to the same thing. And pluralism, which is generally respectful of religious and non-religious traditions, and requires engagement. So it's not just the knowledge of, but getting engaged and involved with people of different backgrounds, and sometimes leading to common action. The reason I bring this list up is because sometimes to become aware of our own fanaticism, neuroses, delusional realities, we need those loved ones in our lives to make them aware of us. Yes? Oh, they didn't. My thumb must not have been there. Thank you for letting me know.
Could you say again,
Sure.
I'm sorry, omniism?
Omniism, yes.
Repeat the description of that.
So this is where someone believes that there are truths that can be found in all religions or belief systems, but one of them doesn't have all of the answers. Sure. Sometimes it's helpful to have those people to remind us of what we can still learn more of. But also it's helpful to know what we're bringing to the table, right? What judgments, what understandings, what stereotypes, what barriers might we be bringing in our own minds and attitudes before we arrive. And it's not going to get rid of them by just knowing them, but being aware of what our perspective is sometimes helps us to establish that ground for conversation. Okay. So let's talk about oops, I'm just going to skip that one. Let's talk about some common ground here. So if we could we pass out the packets now? What you're going to receive in just a moment is a packet. A packet, and I'd like you to flip to a portion in it that has written best practices.
You have extras back.
So skip the first front and back. And if you would, take a few moments and read through those. There's two kind of chunks there. One is mints, starts with mints. And if you would read through those, and we can address some of those thoughts of where to begin in our conversation. So I'll be quiet for a few minutes while you read those. Please refrain from reading any word. Good students that you are. So I'm not going to really really give a lesson on how to talk to somebody. I feel like we all went to kindergarten, most of us went to kindergarten. So we can generally look at the idea of engaging in a respectful manner. But some of us, we feel the barrier within us, maybe we feel like we're going to offend somebody, we're going to say the wrong thing. Some of us might even be starting out with the thought of, and this is very common, is engaging with somebody of a different faith mean that I'm kind of betraying my own faith or tradition? Maybe you don't feel that right now, maybe you felt that in the past, but that is a common barrier to these conversations as well. So we want to make sure that we are entering multi-faith and belief dialogue with respect, curiosity, and a commitment to allow space for everybody's bucket, everybody's spiritual journey, religious and non-religious. It's important also, as this points out, to have a healthy, self-critical perspective toward one's own spirituality. And then a commitment to learn from one another, which turns this into a dialogue instead of a debate. So we want to stay away from debating theologies as much as speaking our own story or when something made sense in this particular way. So you have the tools in front of you. What's going to be offered to you in the next few minutes is within your same packet. On the first page, there are some reflection questions on the front and the back of the first page. And then at the end of the packet, there is a real brief reading that I took from this book that I mentioned. You don't have to be wrong for me to be right. And we're going to allow some time for you to do some individual reading and brief reflection if you want to write down some notes there. And then we're going to get into some groups and try this out. So some words, here's my cheerleader words on our way to you. What if we commit to having a new perspective of the religious or non-religious other? What if we take Hirschfield's example of the helper who is against us, or even Luther's theses as reminders? When we find ourselves asking, how can you think that way, vote that way, raise your children that way? What if we acknowledge that the emotions that fill our hearts, they're a sign of how connected we all are? Because if we're honest, we wouldn't get so mad if we didn't care so much about our entwined future together. So the best advice I can give you as we are heading towards reflection and conversation and making real headway in our multi-faith and belief relationships is this. Let's use every tool we have. Every meditation, every prayer, every ritual, song, and indeed every breath that we have to first be emboldened by our emotions, whether they be joy or mistrust or even rage, and then slowed by our intellects to reframe our conversational partner across the table as simply a different incarnation of the sacred that we all see. So, Marianne, I'm going to revert to you. Do we want to stay in our seats and do readings and reflections, or are we going to move into tables?
Why don't we do readings after we form new groups? Sometimes it's a good idea to meet your folks and to share in the vitality and the wisdom that's in this room. And so what we're going to ask you to do is to perhaps form a circle with 6 to 8 people in it that have some new people that perhaps you've not met before. And we'll do the readings there in the circle. And then eventually Elizabeth will lead us into conversation and dialogue. So be brave, make your new circles, meet a new friend, do your readings, and just a bit of logistics in case you're not familiar with where we are. There are restrooms down the hall to our left and to our right. You can follow the signs. There is coffee and refreshments back there if you need that. So about 15 minutes of reading time. I think that's good.
I do want to say one thing so it's not confusing to you when you're in the midst of this reading. There's one paragraph that might not make much sense to you. It's referring to the author, Hirschfield, and his wife dealing with their daughter's illness and just talking about the different ways that they dealt with that emotional abuse. Again, the helper who is against us might show us how much we have a common value. So when you come to that, don't stress. If you haven't read the rest of the book, you're not stressed. So go ahead and get refreshments. Maybe circle up into groups of 4 or 5. We can do our reading and reflection, and I'll call time, and then we can begin our conversation. students, my first year, first generation college students. We read this is the first text that we read in study. So I think it has just some good gems, good nuggets of advice for life. So I hope you enjoyed the reading. But I'd like to engage in conversation with you, and we're going to have a microphone. Marianne's going to walk around with the microphone if you'd like to ask any questions, observations about what just took place. Any new realizations, difficulties, insights on having these conversations, or reactions? We'll just kind of leave it open and start there. Any thoughts, comments? Anybody? Gordon?
I would say that the title of the book itself is a great start.
Can you wait for the mic?
Yeah, okay.
The title of the book itself, I think, is a great starting point, because it's something that all of us have experienced. If you get into a discussion with someone, you have to be right and they have to be wrong. And I think that's a great starting point for the conversation here.
Especially in U.S. American culture, we're pretty poor listeners when it comes down to it. We have the you're with us or against us mentality. And a lot of us have the willingness to want to engage and listen, but we don't really have the skills. We don't know what to do with the people in between, where I want to respect you and listen, but I almost feel we do the thing where we're taught in school to tilt your head slightly to the side and smile real softly and nod while you're crafting your defense. So it's moments like this where we try to still our hearts and our minds to do that style of listening. And there's lots of different, if you're interested in this, lots of different styles of listening. Active listening, we're listening for our whole body, right? There's a difference if you're listening to somebody's story like this rather than with a furrowed brow, right? There's deep listening where you're listening and you're not actually responding. It's almost like, imagine we're all sitting around a campfire, staring into the campfire. Sometimes truths bubble up at that moment, because not all the eyes are staring. Show your story, tell me your story, right? We're staring at the campfire, and sometimes there's the courageousness that comes with sharing in an anonymous way. So there's lots of ways to engage. Not sure what we're going to do. Any other comments, observations, insights, difficulties that came up in that process?
I think for me, in some of these conversations, not right now, but in life, I don't really have a strategy for sitting down and talking with someone who is in an exclusive position. I just don't really know how to get to that value or the interest or the place. How to move a little past that, you're wrong, before I even open my mouth.
How do you raise your children like that?
Yeah, any idea?
Anybody want to share any wisdom, insight that they've had in those moments? I know I popped in a few groups and people were giving some comparisons of how to do that in life, but there is a broad spectrum of that attitude we arrive with, and that definitely shapes the conversation. Anybody want to share any metaphors or stories?
Not that we necessarily use it, but in Jewish tradition, there's something called machloket, which means when I'm in a conversation with you, especially when we're challenged, I have to state what you're talking about and make sure that I understand what you're saying, and then you need to do the same, so that if you're getting me wrong, it's like, no, that's not quite it, So it's a structured way of doing deep listening and knowing that you've been heard. Because I think that's what most people want.
Yeah, validation goes along.
Yeah.
Any other strategies that anybody wants to offer?
I had one of those odd experiences where I just read an
had one of those odd experiences where I just read an article that talked about strategies to do that. And one of them was just to say, tell me more before you interject or interrupt the flow of thought. And the very next day, a friend of mine, I didn't ask him if he read the same article, but we're talking. And he said, tell me more. And I was surprised because it was just the right thing for him to have said, for me to have proceeded with maybe being a little bit, closer to him in what I was revealing, about a son of mine that I might otherwise have been. And then, the next day, I was involved in a conversation with my son. And I wanted to, say something about what he just said, but tell me more. And it worked again.
I think we have to get that over. While you're heading that way, I wanted to just mention a parallel to the Israeli-Palestinian story that Hirschfeld was writing about. I remember I was in a class one time, and we were involved once again in a debate, a very heated debate over the abortion issue. And that was one of those instances where I felt like finding that, or acknowledging that common value, that both sides of that very polarized argument, at the core, value life. And I feel like when we can get to that, it doesn't solve the problem, but when we can get to that point where we're acknowledging that we share that common value, it sets a different attitude there. Because we disagree on that.
I really like what this gentleman said about tell me more. And I think when I'm able to ask that question and invite them to talk about the experiences, the concrete experiences that he, usually our conversations are more abstract, they're generalizations from concrete experiences. And I think the closer we get to describing the actual experience, the easier it is to understand and then share at that level too.
I shared with the group here a conclusion that I came to as we were going through this material, and I said, I must be basically a lot of superficial conversations because it takes me some challenge to remember a conversation which was digging to the depth that we're talking about here. And I presume the conclusion from that is that I don't seek it out. I just insulate myself with people who are like me, unfortunately.
Can anybody say they do the same thing? It's much less scary to live that way, for sure. We've got time for about 2 more comments before we close.
I was wondering to get to common values, could you ask a question like, how did you come to believe that? Would that be a strategy to get to some common value, to their values?
And sometimes if the conversation is grounded in the element of faith with religion, sometimes it's a good way to start in a more practitioner way to say, maybe what in your faith tradition leads you to understand it in that way, or leads you to believe it.
One more. I saw another hand.
So often I associate with people with whom I am diametrically opposed on various issues. And I can talk to them about many things, but I avoid talking to them about the issues and big differences we have. I just avoid those issues. So I'm not sure how I'm being productive.
Maybe you are the one that's providing that common ground so other people can have those diametrically opposed conversations.
Well, Elizabeth, you have proved to us what CSU saw when they awarded that degree to you. Please, let us give her a round of applause.
It's like church, you can't leave till we do an accent. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for sharing your wisdom with us. What a wonderful evening. We just have a couple things. Our next event is October 17th at Trinity Lutheran. It's a world of wisdom and stories and storytelling. There's a flyer in the back that'll tell you the different stories from different wisdoms that people will be sharing. There's also, do you remember Janine Hill Fletcher? She's been here a couple times. She's a theologian from Fordham. She's got a new book out called The Sin of White Supremacy, and the flyers are in the back to tell you how you can order that. Someone else gave us a statement from Christian ethicists without borders on white supremacy and racism. So these are kind of just in what's going on with the news today and where the theologians make a statement. Also the back, David Reed, thank you for sharing your wonderful space as you always do in First United Methodist. David runs the library here as well as Adult Faith Formation, and he has all these wonderful books in the back, and if you would like to check one out, there's a sign-up sheet, and you're welcome to take and use what you like. There's some really great ones back there. Our new website will be coming soon. As you know, we're transitioning from Theologian in Residence program to World Wisdoms Project, so watch for that. We now have a Facebook page, thanks to Meg Small. So World Wisdoms Project, if you want to check us out there. And two last things. One, if you would help put your chair away, that would really help out the team at First United. And we're going to be handing out an evaluation now. And we'll be giving away the book that Elizabeth talked about. You don't have to be wrong for me to be right. So if you fill out the evaluation and put your name at the bottom, we'll do a drawing. Bribery. Okay. Have a great night. Thanks for coming. Hope to see you on the 17th.